Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Fiddler's Responsible AI podcast series. We have with us Scott Zoldi, who is a Chief Analytics Officer at FICO. Scott has been working on responsible AI and explainable AI and analytics for a long period of time at FICO, almost 19 years. And he has also published a new report regarding the adoption of responsible AI in the industry. And we're very excited to welcome him to this podcast. Welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me, Krishna. It's a pleasure to be part of the podcast.
Awesome. Scott, maybe just I gave a brief introduction. Maybe you can give our audience a little bit more about how you got into this area, a bit about your background, what sort of propelled you into analytics and machine learning.
Yeah, happy to do so. So I'm Chief Analytics Officer at FICO, and FICO is a company that powers billions of AI-driven decisions yearly. It's a big part of our business. We focus on the right types of machine learning and AI technologies to power these decisions. In fact, our fraud solutions power about 2/3 of the world's fraud decisions. And as part of this, right, we've had this constantly active focus on the proper leveraging of artificial intelligence and machine learning in decisioning, but also explaining that. I've been the CIO for 5 years, and during that time, I've authored over 110 patents. 62 are granted, about 48 still pending. And so I'm very active in this area of kind of machine learning technologies and special IP for decisioning. And in fact, a lot of my research recently has been focused around these concepts of responsible AI, AI development, blockchains for understanding the model governance, and then ethics and interpretable models and explainable models, and when to use what and what is appropriate for different use cases. So it's a huge part of our business, a huge focus from my personal interest as a researcher to ensure that we leverage these technologies appropriately in the field, and then we can do so responsibly.
Thanks, Scott. That's a great background. As an AI practitioner, what's on top of mind for you these days?
So one of the things that's top of mind for me is essentially this period that we went through with COVID, right, in the pandemic. And in my mind, it was really an opportunity for many to kind of look at what they're doing from an AI and machine learning perspective with a little bit more realism. Right. There had been such an insane amount of energy and excitement around AI machine learning that if you didn't have it in your toaster, you were somehow behind the times. And now I think we're looking at this and saying, listen, we had to manage a business through a difficult time. Many organizations didn't understand how their models worked. They didn't understand what to monitor. They were under huge amounts of strain and stress, and potentially didn't give their customers the very best sort of service during these times because they didn't understand these models. And that's all for me coming back to this sort of concept that the hype cycle is starting to diminish and getting more focus on it's time for AI and AI development to grow up and to be monitored and to be carefully developed and around concepts such as explainable, interpretable models, ensuring that can be done properly is a main focus and top of mind. And I think it's for other researchers as some of them may have struggled during the pandemic, trying to understand the pedigree of their model development, how best to monitor or adjust their strategies. And some of them just abandoning machine learning models altogether, which may or may not have been the right move during the pandemic. And so I think this is really a wake-up call for many. And it's a great thing for topics like responsible AI, where we want to make sure that if we're using a tool that can do great social good, we also have to make sure that we're not going to do inadvertent social harm by using these technologies when we don't understand them well and we can't monitor that they're doing well in production.
Yeah, that's a great point. People talk about responsible AI and many companies are putting out responsible AI frameworks these days. What is responsible AI to you, Scott?
So there's four major components. The first component in my eyes are what I call robust AI. And this is essentially, going back to how we used to build models, which was, understand the data very deeply, ask the data ethics questions up front, understand the pedigree of that data, the sampling, state before we build the model where a model built with this sort of data could be used and could not be used, and what is the bias within this data. Focus on the algorithms that need to be used, right? Maybe constrained based on the types of environments that we work on. And then as we build those models, do so thoughtfully around ensuring we have the right degrees of freedom, we have proper support, understand where if the customer behavior changes, the model may no longer be the proper thing to use. And then do stability testing, right? To ensure that we understand where this model may fall down. That's robust AI. And I think that's just proper model development. Very often in these push button worlds where you can go and get access to open source and type a few keywords and you get a model, it's very different than to really do this sort of intensive sort of development work. The next part of it would be around explainable AI, right? Really understanding what's driving this model. This is both from a model development perspective, so you understand what are the nonlinearities and drivers that really impact how the model behaves, but also from ability to explain to a customer specifically how they got to that point and what she could do to maybe improve her situation moving forward. Third would be ethical AI, making a concerted effort to remove bias learned from the model. So even if we've done a really great job understanding bias in data and we've chosen good model technologies, we still need to look at each of these sort of learned relationships and understand whether or not imputed bias may be learned through other features which in combination could infer or expose a protected class to disparate sort of impact. And the final part of this is what I used to call it efficient AI, now I call it auditable AI, but it's really around how you efficiently and proactively monitor the model. And FTC put out some great guidance a couple of years back, and they said, to be ethical with models is not just to develop an ethical model, but to monitor that model. And so that'd be the fourth point, which is you need to have all this sort of codified, right? And I use things like a model development governance blockchain to make sure that I have all those details so that in production, we know exactly what to monitor and how to ensure that the model is operating as intended. It's not enough to just build these models and do a great job in the lab and high five each other and then go away, right? It really only time it really matters is when customers are being scored by these models. So we best be looking at that and monitoring it.
Right. Awesome. So really four things: model robustness, explainability, and ethics, and also like monitoring. So let's touch upon a few of those things. So if I'm an enterprise, I'm starting to put in AI in my business, why should I think about ethics and responsible use of AI? Why is it important?
So I think one of the things that's really important is that when we make these decisions, right, and we don't know how the analytic could operate, right, we will have unintended consequences, right? And we see many of these things in the news where, a model's built to help with hiring decisions, but it was based only on white males, and therefore only white males get the offers, right? And so people will apply technology, but not necessarily be asking all these very critical questions to ensure that this model is fair. Now, it's interesting, this Corinium report, right, that we did, many of the researchers there basically said that, I think 43% of them said, I don't have to do anything more than what's regulated from a responsible and ethical AI perspective. And in my view, I'd say, well, when is it okay not to be ethical with the use of these models? And I'd say probably it's not. But for those that have that vantage point, right, I think the other aspect of this is that the customer advocacy around improper sort of scoring with these models or impact will come back onto that organization if they're building models without a framework around responsible AI and ethics, and it could have big impacts on an organization's revenue, could have a big impact on their customers and harm some, right, and then also on the brand, right? And so if we leave this to a data scientist and just assume that the machine learning is smart enough to deal with it all, that's not the case. A single data scientist is usually not going to have the totality of skill set to ensure they build a model that meets all those needs, and it's really
Right.
critical. Otherwise, most organizations should step away from machine learning until they develop that level of expertise to do this so safely.
Awesome. That's very interesting. So you sort of wrote a recent report where I think where you found that there is a lack of urgency around responsible AI use, and that's putting most companies at risk. Why do you think that is happening? Why is the industry not adopting this technology as fast as were probably expecting?
Well, I think there's two factors, right? The survey was done as we were coming, through the back end of the pandemic, and we're still in it in many, unfortunately, many global regions. But part of it is just, I think most organizations were struggling just to do this digital transformation, right? And so maybe ethics wasn't the top thing on their list, right?
Mhm.
Because they were just trying to maintain their business. I do think, right, there is a lot of confusion around an opinion around where and when these organizations need to be ethical and responsible. And so in these sort of trying times, right, it falls down. I also think that some organizations will have diversity boards or ethics teams. They tend to be a tiny minority of the organization, and sometimes that makes people feel better, right? So but it's like a Band-Aid on a cancer. It doesn't do anything. It might make you feel a little bit better to see that adhesive on your arm, let's say, but it's the level of investment needed is much larger. So I think it's a combination of not understanding exactly why and when they have to be worried about it. Maybe a shifting set of priorities because people were adjusting to the new digital transformation during the pandemic. And then I think going forward, though, we're going to see a change, right? We already see some of these changes with the EU regulation, dictating certain types of AI, machine learning are very high risk, right? And it's bringing into light the fact that even if things are not regulated, there are responsibilities that organizations have, right? And I think this will start to catch up as everyone kind of hopefully gets back to a new normal. And then these concepts of ethics and responsibility will continue to come more into the light of day.
Yeah, so it sounds like really organizational buy-in, like from the top, is required, and it's sort of missing today. And as a challenge, and is basically probably a challenge for implementing responsible AI. What are some of the other challenges that you have seen, maybe like from a technology standpoint or a educational knowledge and skill standpoint that probably are stopping these practices to be implemented?
So one of the things that we saw was, we surveyed 100 of these chief analytics officers and chief AI officers and chief data officers, and about 65% said they can't explain how the models made their decisions, right? And so, I think that speaks to an education issue with respect to education issue and or a standards issue around how they want to run their business, right? I've used to say for the past 5 years, explainability first and prediction second, right? And that's very different than when you're in a Kaggle competition, right? You would get any little level of noise to outperform someone else in a model, whether or not it's robust or not, typically not robust, right? So I think, one of the aspects is to basically look at where each organization is from a maturity perspective. If you're one of those organizations that don't feel that you could respond to a customer and tell them succinctly and correctly what was the reason why, let's say, an automated decision was made on you that might be unfair, then you have to do a couple of things. One might be you really invest in understanding which explainable AI methods you're using. Are they sufficient? Do you move to interpretable machine learning models? That's a big part of my business today. Or even other sort of analytic techniques that are more linear and more easy to understand so that you can make decisions and you can focus on that explainability factor. I do think, that a lot of the people that are coming into the job force today, spend a lot of time on some of the more interesting machine learning methodologies, but not all of them are really focused on the practicality of ensuring that we explain not on an average sense, but in an individual sense, each and every decision. And I think a lot of the leaders, right, are given pressure by boards. Only about 40% don't understand AI and machine learning or the risks of it, right? And those same boards are forcing people maybe past their comfort levels to adopt technology because it's exciting and we hear about it in the news all the time. But we need those leaders to be educating their boards about the dangers and the risks. And the reality of it, frankly, is, we should be starting from the simplest model and make it a little bit more complicated, but we shouldn't start from the biggest, baddest model that could possibly be created because we want to impress our friends, right, and our colleagues. We should start from the justifying to ourselves that the added level of complexity is worth the risk from an interpretability and a fairness perspective. And very often it's not. The amount of incremental lift you get if you've built a proper model is not that great, right? Particularly given the risk, right? So if you were a chief risk officer, you really understood the ramifications of these decisions, right? They very much would not take on a huge amount of risk to the organization for a very small amount of predictive power improvement. And that gets lost, right? Because we sometimes get excited about the things that shine and shiny objects in our space, right? And recent research, but not all that has to be applied to some of the problems that impact customers and ones that we as data scientists and as organizations are responsible for enabling. Because frankly, the thing that every data scientist needs to recognize and understand is as soon as we package that model and if the people that are using it do not understand that model, typically decision-making gets calloused. And that is a very difficult and bad thing because people won't question the model. And if the model, is not built in a proper way, or if it's not monitored to know when it no longer is operating in a proper way, then it's a very big problem.
Yeah. So I recently saw a LinkedIn post where building models in production in an organization is not like participating in a Kaggle competition, right? You need to take into all these factors into account: the robustness, monitoring, whether the model is performing how you expect in production. So switching gears, you touched upon model monitoring. How are you? What are some of the challenges with respect to model monitoring that you see in enterprise today? It sounds like a lot of companies don't have the low-level model monitoring. They instead they probably very focus on more business metrics monitoring. Why do you think it's important to monitor models?
So I think the number one reason it's important to monitor models is this concept of it's not ethical if you're not monitoring it to ensure it's ethical, right? And it's not performance if you're not measuring performance, right? The sad fact of the survey that we did was only 20% of these CIOs and chief AI officers and chief data officers, only 20% are monitoring the models for fairness and ethics. And I think there's a few contributing factors of that. One is they lack the sort of tools to properly monitor, right? They may lack the investment to monitor these decisions in an active way. They may look at it once a year and make a decision whether they have to retrain a model, right? But they don't have this sort of from a first principles perspective. Once that monitoring goes hand in hand with the production use of this particular model. And then I think that the third thing is if about 2/3 can't explain what the model does in when they build it, then they don't know what to monitor in terms of what is whether it's being fair or not, or changing its behavior in production. And so this is why crossing this chasm of when the model's developed, you should understand what drives that model. And in my world, I extract the latent features and I make them interpretable, and I know exactly the latent features that are going to have the biggest impact in driving decisions. And those are the things that I'll monitor, right? So I can the latent feature is just a little piece of the model. You can monitor the behavior of that through statistics and understand if it's shifting. But if you're someone that's not getting into the model to really understand how it's working today and what the most important features are, I think most of them, even if they were given a tool or an IT budget to go monitor it, wouldn't know what to monitor. So it's twofold problem. It's what do I do to monitor appropriately, and then I think there is an infrastructure thing where people are not really understanding that it is in some sense, even a moral obligation to monitor these models that are impacting customers.
Right. So you actually touched upon feature shifts and extracting latent features and observing them over time. And we when we sort of started working with our customers during the pandemic, we saw a bunch of people who experienced this phenomenon. Models were trained with pre-COVID data, and when COVID happened, data shifted and models became less accurate. So tell me, like, let's dive deeper into this topic a little bit. What is model drift? Why does why do models lose in terms of their predictive power? What happens to models when you deploy to production?
Yeah, so this comes back to this concept of robust AI, right? And so models will drift because they have, when they were built under assumptions that the development data on which they were built is going to be a very good approximation for the production data under which they're used, right? And very often, not a lot of time is spent ensuring that a model is robust. So for example, like if you wanted to ensure that you could build a model and you can't touch that model for 1 year, right? Then what you would do in building this model is you would focus on doing simulation of the most sensitive variables to data shift while you build this model, right? And then you can remove those features that show more sensitivity to what would be likely changes in the data environment moving forward. So there's ways to make models more robust, but the entire focus on model drift is really to make it less sensitive to likely data drift, right? And the worst cases of this would be things where you overspecified a model and you've overtrained a model and you get this tremendous sort of rock curve that shows great performance, right? But it's based on, let's say, data that reflects, let's say, only the winter holiday. We're here in the U.S., right? You have they have the holiday period, and then you have Valentine's or whatever else, and then you try to use that model in the summer, and it's not robust because it hasn't seen the summer patterns, right? And expects that it is the holiday. And most practitioners will recognize the importance of robustness of the data. But then there's a whole nother job around ensuring that you build the model to be less sensitive to these shifts in data. That's hard though, right? When you overspecify a model, and that's why certain types of models will degrade much, much more quickly than other types of models. So most of the models that are leveraging kind of very high levels of degrees of freedom, right, very often perform well, and you'll say, well, it looks better than a neural network, and it looks better than a GANs model. And it does on paper, right? But out of time, very often they degrade very rapidly. And from that perspective, it's a problem. And the reason why I get so focused on this is because on the flip side, people are trying to assign staff to work this model, right? It drives their entire business metrics around the return on investment, whether it's a originations model or a fraud prevention or crime model, right? So if you see variances in the predictive power, right, of this particular model because someone chose to impress their boss and not build a robust sort of scorer, right, then you get this sort of disparate sort of impact in terms of a much larger drop in performance. Whereas if somebody just built it robustly with let's say a simpler architecture, maybe even a single layer neural network, you may not impress your friends at the bar, but when it's in production, it'll be much, much more stable, and operationally you'll be much more happy because you don't have these sort of operational impacts. And we've also seen that, right? Some of the models that we built, some of our customers build their own models, right? We like to run two models at the same time, and some of the ones where you have these sort of push button systems for producing a model, they would degrade within a few weeks. Right. Whereas others, degrade over a few years. And, I think that's something that we all have to think about when we build these models is what do we want the shelf life to be? If it's only a few weeks, right, that's very different than building a model that we'd like to be robust for a year or more and predictable.
Right. That's a great point. So you mentioned how model monitoring is essential for building robust models. But when we speak to some of our customers, they say, yes, we monitor, but then we find out that they kind of generate an ad hoc report once every 6 months, to check some stats, right?
Yep.
What do you, in your opinion, is an efficient way to do model monitoring? what are some of the principles to keep in mind?
So I think that some of the basics of this is to ensure that you're getting data on a regular basis, right? So you need to do this in a timely fashion. So you need to ensure you have the pipe. Now, once you have the pipe of data that flows through, one of the most efficient ways is just to estimate, for example, the basic statistics associated with the data, the basic statistics associated with those input features. And then when you're using a machine learning model, you want to have the statistics associated, let's say, with the latent features, so you can understand how those are shifting over time. And if you've done the proper sort of model development or robust AI development, you'd know which ones are important and which ones would drive the score more strongly. And so that allows you to understand what's shifting, right? You can look at those distributions, come up with measures of where they are differing, and ideally set thresholds under which you raise an alarm. Other ways of doing that are a little bit more sophisticated would be using things like autoencoder technologies, right? Which would basically say that the feature space has shifted in such a way that for Scott, he's not really appropriate for this model. And so this is where we're getting these concepts of humble AI, right? Where maybe the model is good for 98% of the customers, but for 2%, they're out of character. There's low coverage for them in what we developed, and we move to a simpler model. And so, when you look at it from that perspective, model monitoring and model scoring become one and the same, because the monitoring will give you a level of confidence in using your model. Where there is not confidence, it's responsible to move to something you have more confidence in, right? And so that would be the other sort of focus. And a lot of what we do is focus on confidence of models and coverage of data. And I believe in generalization, right? But if I've literally never seen data that is similar to a customer that I'm scoring today, I could put on a blindfold and just assume that the principles of generalization would work. Or I could be a little bit honest with myself and say, listen, we've never seen data like Scott's before. And yes, the model probably is okay, but I don't know if it's okay. And therefore, I'm going to move to something which is either simpler, where I can understand more easily how I made the decision about Scott, or maybe even drop all the way down to a policy decision, right? Which is more rules driven. But that's that monitoring component, is to understand which customers are out of character and what do you want to do about that.
Right. So it sounds like monitoring sub slices of the data or segments of data is very important, not just looking at the overall AUC and overall metrics, but also looking at various sub slices so that it's making optimal decisions for most of your users. So switching gears a little bit, Scott, we talked about a little bit about fairness and bias. This is a big topic today. One of the challenges within the industry is, in order to measure fairness, you need to know the protected attributes of like the user, right? So, and there is like privacy concerns and how you would get those protected attributes. So there seems to be some trade-offs here between how effectively can you measure fairness versus how we can respect the user's privacy. What are some of your thoughts about actually operationalizing fairness measurement in an enterprise?
Yeah, it's a complicated topic, right? So, this concept of debiasing models based on these protected classes are generally prohibited, right? You have to be very careful if you're doing that in model development, because that activity itself can be bias, right? And impute bias. My focus today is really on ensuring that when we develop the models, right, that we can understand what drives these models, and in particular these latent features, right? I get very suspicious and concerned when someone tells me that my deep learning model somehow figured out there must be a relationship between these three things, right? And I'd say, well, what is the relationship? We don't know, but the deep learner told me. Well, that's not sufficient, right? I mean, what's sufficient is to go and pull out those latent features. Now, when you do that, right, things you can ask questions about your model that you wouldn't otherwise, right? Because now you're getting to the features within this model that are actually might drive disparate impact. And so, for example, right, we might look at a particular latent feature and say, okay, let's look at the distribution of just this latent feature, not the outcome, whether or not someone will be delinquent or not, right? Or whether I commit fraud or not. Let's just look at a latent feature between two variables that I know is important. And what does the distribution look like between three different protected classes? Is it the same distribution? Is this just statistically different, right? And then we can drive some indication that, well, from a class perspective, this latent feature might be 4 times more likely to activate for, let's say, the orange class than the blue class. And so even though the latent feature might make a lot of sense, like if you ask any human being, they say, yeah, the relationship between, let's say, number of delinquencies and the size of the mortgage and the fact that those two features come together to create more risk, everyone would probably agree with that. But if we see a systematic bias across the classes with respect to that latent feature, we don't have to build the model to know that we might have a problem. We'll know that that activates maybe 4 times more for the orange class than the blue class. So there are ways at looking at this, right? I always look at things that like that to really ask the question and then look at it that direction, because then you're not necessarily haven't built the model yet.
Right.
Just looking at those learned features and whether or not you think there's a class disparity in terms of how often they're going to be activated or not activated.
Right. So that's a good point. So you mentioned one of the foundations to do this job is to be able to extract latent features in your data even before you build those models. Could you touch upon those? What are some of the techniques to do those, and how can you do it more effectively?
Yeah. So one of the things that we focus on is we have constraint-based neural networks. All right. So you can constrain the cost function associated with one of your learners to minimize the number of weights. So essentially, you have pretty strong regularization in place, which basically means, right, that you're going to have as few connections as possible, right? So you bias the training to favor a simpler architecture. Others would take, whatever model they built and then systematically start pruning it, right, to reduce the complexity. That's another direction. Still others, have basically GAMS-based models where there's a lot of the nonlinearity is a linear additive feature. So there's a number of different approaches when we want to get into this concept of interpretable models. My personal preference and favorite is essentially this, what we call an interpretable latent feature neural networks, where we essentially constrain the training to the fact that no one latent feature can have any more than 2 connections, which is very different than a fully connected neural network, which, in theory, you have all connections active, which makes it almost impossible to understand what that latent feature is doing. And by doing that, then we can go and extract and ask the questions. Furthermore, though, what's really interesting is then you can further impose constraints. So constraints like palatability and monotonicity can be learned in a constraint during training, not something that you haphazardly come across, right? So, one of the things that causes models to not be accepted sometimes is, let's say, if I ask for a larger mortgage balance and I become a better credit risk, right? Then doesn't make a lot of sense, right? And there should be a monotonic relationship between the amount of money that I'm trying to ask for and the risk level. But in machine learning models, monotonicity is often not a constraint that gets enforced. And so, I think it all goes into this sort of bucket of, okay, we're going to constrain our models to be sensible and responsible. And part of that's going to be monotonicity and palatability, and part of that's going to be explainability and simplicity. But those are some of those methods.
Right. It sounds like it's not just sufficient to explain it, but that explanation should be rational. Like if it's not rational for a human being, it's not having a monotonic relationship in certain cases, it doesn't make sense, right? So it's very interesting. Yeah, that's cool. And so, basically when you think about the entire ML workflow, you kind of touched upon, how when you give it a data set, you start with assessing the data set, using these techniques that you inferred, to get extract latent features. Once you know your data, then you start, trying, different models, and then you kind of monitor the performance of the models. You understand the slices of it. It sounds like this is a really highly iterative process, right? So tell me about, what is the practice today and where should the industry move forward, and it sounds like a lot of companies today have a very simple linear flow where, they take a data, build a model, throw it into the production, and then there's they don't touch it for a number of years. And so help me out like here, how people can move from this very simple workflow to like a more of a, more of a robust workflow that you're describing.
Yeah. So I think one is a change of vantage point, right? Which is, that. So for in many organizations, right, you have the data scientists. Many of them, are not part of the operational environments, right? And one of the true benefits that I have working at FICO is I get to see the use of our models by clients and understand how they use these models, right? So one is, if you're in an organization where you're building the model, you need to see yourself as part of the success of the production environment. And if you put that front of mind, that means that, the job doesn't end when the model is released. The job only begins when the model is released. And so then the data scientist is vested, right? Whether or not that model is good or not is not based on a model report, and it's not based on a pat on the back by her manager, right? It's going to be based on the operational performance and the stability of that model, which means that, moving from today, which is generally, I'm done with the model, I wash my hands of it, I'm done, right? And so it's not someone else's problem. And if they don't monitor it, then I have no problems, right? Until, but if I say, no, Scott, you're going to be responsible for the fact that we're going to monitor this. And, and furthermore, you're going to have to tell us what we monitor. You're going to have to tell us when does it raise the warning bell. And based on those warning bells, we're going to make a decision, do we have to retrain that model? Do we move to a different architecture, right? And I think that mindset has to shift, because right now, we have this sort of situation where, the many data scientists build models in their R, their Python, or the Scala, whatever else, right? And they hand it off to some engineering team, right, and the two don't talk, right? And that's that. Whereas in my environment, for example, right, I am actually, I all my models are built in the production software. All the data is coming back directly for monitoring them in my environment. So I'm 360, right? And so, I get the real-time feedback. And if organizations started to ask those questions, right, if they started to say, okay, what are the three? Let's start with three. What are the three things that we have to monitor in terms of metrics from a monitoring perspective, so that you, Scott, have confidence that the model should be used, right? And then we'll move it to 7 or 10, right? That would be the proper way to start this journey, right? Right now, I don't think, given that survey where 20% are not even monitoring their models for shifts and biases, right? Means that, the majority don't even have that conversation, right? And if they ask that question, then they'll know what are the hot topics, right, that they have to be monitoring. And they can start a program around having the right monitoring software in there and the right bells and whistles to alarm when it's time to do something different.
Awesome. Great. Scott, finally, going forward, what do you think are the three most important things that teams have to focus on in developing responsible AI solutions in their organizations in the next few years? The broader things that they should focus on.
So I think three. Well, I think number one would be teams need to recognize that a model development standard, and one that's set at a corporate level or a company level, is essential, right? So that's number one. And for some data scientists, this is a stark change from what their academic lives were, or their research lives were. And so it's moving from the fact that you're a practitioner versus a researcher, and those two things can live in happy harmony. Trust me, I've written 110 patents. I can do both and find a way to make it a happy harmony for myself. But get them aligned around the fact that we're going to have a standard. We're going to iterate that standard so that models are built the same way. We understand how we're going to look at this across the board. So that would be the first one, this level of standard. I think the second major piece then is to implement that standard, right? To be truthful to it. And that's why we have things like, with my organization, analytic tracking documents and regular sort of sprint and agile reviews. We have success criteria. And if we're not successful, we call it out. And we focus more attention on things that we're not meeting. And more, the projects are persisted to the blockchain, right? That makes it real, right? It's not enough to say, yeah, the model's great. But when you put your name on the line in a blockchain, for all eternity, right? It basically says, no, I've done my very best effort to make sure that it's enforceable, right? So you can have a standard that we all agree is the right standard. And I think this is what happens in many organizations, and no one follows it because it's not enforced. So enforceability through blockchain is another major component of this. And then I think the third piece is, get into that production focus, right? The only value of your model comes from when it is in production. It's providing that business value, and
Right.
you as a data scientist feel comfortable in using it. And if those three steps can be taken, right, I think we make a whole lot of progress towards moving organizations to a responsible AI framework that's audited, enforceable, and monitored, right? And that would be the holy grail of growing up a little bit and moving AI out of kind of research environments where it could be the good, the bad, and the ugly in terms of how they're implemented, to one where everybody can sleep better at night and ensure that they're doing their very best to build these models and ensure that they're responsible when they're impacting their customers.
Awesome. That's a great point, Scott. I think it sounds like responsible AI framework is the way to go in terms of safely operationalizing machine learning models, and for every organization to consider. It was a great session today. Thanks for providing a lot of insights into how to implement this framework in an enterprise level. Really appreciate you for joining this podcast.
Well, thank you again for having me. It's a great topic. I'm glad you're having this as a venue to share. So thank you very much, Krishna. I appreciate the time too.
Awesome. Thank you.